I think, firstly, there's going to be a lot of data in this presentation, and I think rather than sort of sitting there trying to sort of take down a whole load of notes, very happy to make it available to anyone that would like a copy. Where that data comes from, ReturnPath's got relationships with mailbox providers around the world. So, you know, that's some of the very familiar names like your Hotmails, your Yahoos, your Gmails. That includes relationships with some of the main mailbox providers here in Poland. And it basically means that we have visibility of email activity in about 2.5 billion inboxes globally. What we've also done is we've built up what we call the consumer data network. You can think of this as a panel of about 2.5 million people around the world who have given us permission to record some of their inbox activity and behavior at an aggregated and anonymized level. So we can plug in email programs and say, how are you responding and interacting to those emails? And then we use that data to work directly with email senders and also with partners like FreshMail to help people do a better job of making sure their emails get delivered, that they're improving customer response to their emails, what does the competitive landscape look like, and also helping to deal and mitigate with any kind of email fraud risks which might be affecting your program. We're here to talk about how the value of email can be leveraged for your companies. And I think we'll just start off with a couple of useful stats. So, some good news stories from some Direct Marketing Association research. Over 90% of email program owners say that email has a vital strategic role to play as part of their company's marketing communications efforts. More good news is that over 50% of budget holders are planning on increasing their email spend this year. So clearly they're doing something right. Another great piece of research from Salesforce Marketing Cloud, this has just been published. 80% of respondents said that email marketing clearly demonstrates return on investment for their companies. And the way that you can flip that over is looking at the right-hand side of the graph, and actually less than 1% don't believe that email generates any kind of ROI at all for their companies. What does that ROI look like? Again, coming back to the Direct Marketing Association, some recent research suggests that it's a pretty impressive number, somewhere in the region of 30 euros in return for every €1 that's getting spent on email. So it's a good news story for everyone that's here today, and I think probably the only question is, if it's that great, why aren't we all doing more of it? And of course, there's some challenges which you've got to overcome, and we're going to be talking about a few of those in the next few slides. So let's first of all talk about email deliverability. And ReturnPath's now 16 years old, and if you go right back to the beginning of ReturnPath, in its original intention, ReturnPath was an email deliverability company and working with senders like yourselves to help you make sure that as much as possible of your emails ended up in your customers' inboxes. Deliverability has changed a lot over the years, but some things hold true. It's still not that easy. So this was a recent report which we published the month before last, and around the world, the reality is that just under 80% of commercial marketing email actually ends up in a recipient's inbox, which is where you want them to be so that they see and interact with those emails. So some of the reasons for that, we've got this snakes and ladders chart, and I'll talk you through it very quickly, because a lot of your deliverability still comes down to how the major mailbox providers see you as a sender. Do they think you're a good sender? Do they think you're a bad sender? Or somewhere in between? And one of the tools that they use to judge what you look like as a sender is your reputation, which you can think of, it's a little bit like a credit score. So the same way that you get judged in terms of, are you a good credit risk to borrow money from the bank? Things that determine your sender reputation are the percentage of complaint activity that your emails generate. So when people receive them and they perhaps don't like what they're receiving and they hit the junk button, the mark as spam button, that's visible to the mailbox providers and it sends a negative signal to them. Things like your unknown user rates. So unknown user rates, think of bounce activity. The more bounce activity you're generating, the dirtier your list looks like, and the mailbox providers are making a judgment in terms of saying, you don't seem to be paying a whole lot of attention to list hygiene, data quality. That also makes you look like a worse sender. Spam traps, so these are effectively email addresses which should never be in your list because they were never permissioned to be in the list. And some of the mailbox providers actually deliberately make these kind of addresses available so that programs that are less careful about how they bring addresses into their program can be identified. And particularly pristine spam traps, which should never be in a good senders list. If they are seen by a mailbox provider, you are going to be dealt with harshly in terms of having your activity blocked. Things like sender permanence, consistently broadcasting from a consistent platform, making sure that you've got appropriate authentication techniques in place like SPF and DKIM, all important. Now these are deliverability basics, and in the hands of a company like FreshMail, you guys are in good hands. They're doing a lot of that for you to make sure that your email programs look like a good actor. The other thing is the way that your customers themselves are interacting with their emails, and this is actually in your hands. FreshMail are going to give you a load of great advice. Ultimately, it's up to you to make sure that you're sending engaging and relevant emails, which your customers are engaging positively with. We'll be talking about that more in a moment. Coming back to this idea of sender reputation, this is effectively how it works. An ideal sender would have a score of 100. Some of these parameters, which we've talked about, things like spam traps, complaints, etc., reduce that score. So this real-life example that you've got on the screen in front of you ends up with a score of 80 out of 100. So what's the implication? Here's another recent piece of research which you can actually pick up from the Return Path website if you're interested, basically showing the relationship between sender score in deciles, rankings of 10, and average inbox placement. And you can see it's the programs which are generating scores of somewhere between 91 and 100 are the ones that are getting 95% inbox placement. Good news is that it's improving. Good senders are getting better at this, and we can see that the year-on-year inbox placement rates have got better between 2014 and 2015. And in terms of some of those parameters that we're looking like, here's a clear illustration of why they're important. So we talked about the importance of low complaint rates, for example. You can see that it's the senders generating a scores of 91 to 100 that have the lowest complaint rates, the lowest trap rates. So these are factors which combine in terms of making you look like a good actor as far as the major mailbox providers of the world are concerned. There's some resources which are available. Again, as I say, happy to make the presentation available afterwards so that you can have a closer look at these. But in terms of understanding the sender score benchmarks, which I've just been talking about, understanding what your own reputation looks like, you can follow these links and get a better idea in terms of what it looks like for your program. So the next big thing is subscriber engagement. And this has been something which is more front of mind with the major mailbox providers over the last 2 or 3 years. And basically what it means is not only how are your emails getting delivered, but what are your customers doing with them in their inboxes. And subscriber engagement can be calculated as positive, good behaviors, negative, poor behaviors, and indifference. You're just not generating any behavior at all, either good or bad. Some of the things that they're looking at, you'll already be able to monitor and measure. So they're looking for, are you generating opens? Because that's clearly a positive sign of engagement. But some of the behaviors you won't have had traditional visibility of. So for example, are your emails generating a reply? So implying that there's a two-way dialogue, not just a one-way dialogue. Are your emails being moved to the junk folder? That's pretty bad, because it basically means that very little value is being seen in your emails. Are they being recovered from the junk folder? That's great, because it means that even for a good sender, once in a while, one of your emails will end up in the junk folder. But if your customer's going to go looking for it and take the time and trouble to recover that email and put it back in their inbox, then they really wanted it. They see value in what you're sending them. That makes you look like a very good sender. Deleting the emails without opening them, And that's a pretty bad activity. It basically means that the inbox is an active one. There's people who are, logging into that email and interacting with other emails, but the only interaction they're having with your email is to delete it. Moving an email to another folder is good. Getting added to your recipient's address book is good. So when we talk about subscriber engagement, this is quite a narrow definition. This is basically subscriber engagement as the major mailbox providers of the world see it. And depending on how they add all of these parameters together, basically gives them a positive or negative perception of you as an email sender. If it's a positive perception, it's going to contribute to more favorable decisions in terms of how they choose to process and place your emails, and effectively contributing to getting more of your emails into the inbox. The subscriber engagement process starts right at the beginning of how your customers perceive your company as a brand. And an interesting piece of research here, that the single most likely reason that a new customer will sign up for your program is because they perceive your company, your brand, as being trustworthy, and that by providing your email address to them, that you will do the right thing in terms of serving them with useful, relevant content that's aligned with their needs and interests. We've seen this research repeated a number of times. A backup piece of research from FastMap, again, sort of repeating this idea that customers are more likely to share their personal information with you for marketing purposes if you make a strong promise that they're not going to share it with third parties, that if you give them marketing choices to tell them what you want to receive and how often you want to receive it. And again, this issue of trust, that they trust you as a brand to do the right thing with their marketing information. So why is this important? Mostly because it leads to the building of more responsive lists. And we've done some fairly sophisticated analysis at ReturnPath where we've used all of the data that we have access to categorize subscriber inboxes by primary. So the definition of primary is basically this is their first choice email address. It's the one that they log into every day. They might have a lot of personal correspondence in that address, as well as marketing from the brands that they really want to receive email from. Secondary address is typically that sort of Hotmail or Yahoo address, which they use to sign up for other marketing, competitions, surveys, etc. The most important learning here is that whereas the primary addresses will typically form about a quarter of a B2C list, they generate about 5/6 of all of the reads from that list. So the challenge for every email program owner is to try and make sure that you're getting as many of those primary addresses as possible, because they're going to be a load more responsive, they're going to generate a load more revenue for your email program. And that comes back to trust. They're more likely to give you that primary address if there is trust that you will do the right thing with that address. And here's the effect of being able to generate positive email engagement. So what this graph shows is a real-life customer that we worked with a few months ago, and the green line is showing their level of inbox placement at Gmail. And initially, it was flatlining. They were, to all extents and purposes, getting 0% placement at Gmail. And we worked with them to introduce a number of simple changes which basically increased the levels of positive engagement that those customers were generating. And over a 2-week period, you can see that suddenly they looked like a much better sender to Gmail. And they bounced to an inbox placement rate that was somewhere in the mid-90%, and they've stayed there ever since. As a sender, you probably want to be thinking about what can you do to drive engagement. And it's all about relevant content, thinking about the previous presentation, making sure that you're applying appropriate segmentation, good personalization, innovative, creative. This is one of my favorite examples where if you look carefully, you can actually see the steam coming off the top of the Costa coffee. And it creates a great visual image. You can almost smell those coffee beans as they're sort of rising up into the air. Here's the proof. And basically showing you a little graph where you can see that any time Costa employs this animated approach, their read rates increase by an average of 12%, which is great. But also looking at those other engagement metrics, so the dark line, the gray line, is your ISP marked spam. That's your filtering. It's only a third of what it is when they're not using animated images. And that filtering, as we were just explaining, is basically a reflection of the much more positive way that their customers are engaging with these emails. Engagement is partially within your control as an email program owner, but it's also worth mentioning that there's factors which are largely outside of your control. And so here's a really interesting piece of analysis, and the descriptors across the bottom of the graph are basically saying what are the most likely reasons that your customers will complain about one of the emails that you've sent to them. And the three that I've highlighted have very little to do with things that you can control as an email sender. They're saying it might be that I had a bad experience in one of your shops, or you've created some negative publicity in the newspapers. And it's just that the next time they receive an email from you is their next touch point with you as a brand. So they take out that negative sentiment that they're feeling about you as a brand and a company on the email in the form of a complaint. I think other factors which are to some extent beyond your control, weather has a clear impact on email performance. And I'll show the Pop-Tarts example because one of the early companies to recognize this was Walmart in the US, who did some very interesting research that proved a relationship between every time a big hurricane was approaching the US mainland and a correlation in an upshift in the sale of Pop-Tarts. And clearly, American citizens were saying, okay, we're going to have to close all the doors for a couple of days. Let's make sure we've got our favorite comfort food in stock so we can ride out the storm. We've done some more local research here, and I'm not going to talk you through all of the findings, but basically looking at 3 well-known email programs with presence in both the UK and Europe. And interestingly, if you look at the McDonald's graphs for a moment, you'll see that the temperature categorizations, so when the emails were sent, was it cold, was it medium, were the average temperatures high? We can see in the UK, for example, that when temperatures are high, read rates go down and complaint rates go up. Compare that with France, where actually it's just the opposite. Read rates go up and complaint rates go down. So what's the reason for that? Is it in the UK, good weather's so unexpected that when it does happen, the last thing you want to do is go to McDonald's. You actually want to go out to the park and walk your dog, play football with your friends, whereas the behavior in France is different. But clearly, there's a strong correlation between weather conditions and email performance. Another thing to think about is the impact or the potential impact that email fraud might have on your programs. So these are fraudulent senders who are basically pretending to be your brand, sending emails from your sender domain. And I think we probably understand the negative impact in terms of, the risk that they might encourage your customers to install malware on their computers or give away valuable personal information. But it also comes back to this principle of trust. And the point to make here, this is quite a busy graph, but if you get to a point where an average consumer who isn't that sophisticated can no longer differentiate between which are your legitimate emails and which are the fraudulent emails, so they just stop interacting with everything to a lesser extent as a result, that impacts the performance of your legitimate emails. And the graph on the right is basically showing what happens, that on average, this sender, it's a real-life sender, the average filtering rates of their legitimate emails increased by about 50% every time they got hit by one of these fraudulent attacks, because their customers no longer know whether they can trust the legitimate emails or not. That's a few thoughts on the increasing importance of subscriber engagement, particularly as the mailbox providers define it. So with an understanding of deliverability drivers and engagement drivers, what can you do to sort of apply that back into your email programs to make them more effective in terms of revenue that they're driving? 6 to share with you. So I think coming back to the original comment, the obvious thing is get delivered. And I think, as we said earlier, you're in safe hands with FreshMail. This is something they do day and night. Because if you're not getting delivered, all of the other good stuff in terms of being opened, in terms of being clicked, in terms of driving revenue from your programs isn't going to happen. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. I think things that we as a company have seen as trends, particularly over the last 12, 18 months is that there's been a massive upshift in the use of lifecycle automation, triggered emails. And this is a great piece of research from Epsilon. Again, quite a busy graph. But basically what they've done is across their entire customer base of about 3,000 senders, they've categorized all open and click activity by whether it's business as usual emails, so fairly typical batch and blast, versus triggered emails. And what they've demonstrated is that the average open rate for triggered emails is about 75% higher than for the business as usual emails. The average click-through rate for triggered emails is about 150% higher. It's because they're relevant and they're time-specific. The estimate is that this year, as much as 5% of total program volume will be formed by triggered emails. And if you're sending 5% triggered volume, you can expect that on average, that's going to be delivering about 50% of your program revenue. It's a big number. We speak to customers, and a lot of them say, hey, fully recognize what you're talking about, but it's quite hard to set up triggered programs. You know, what about the technology? What about the data? And I think making the point that, yes, to an extent that's an issue, but you can still do some very simple triggered programs, if you haven't started already. Great example here from Ocado. It's basically just the anniversary of when you joined the program. So if you joined them this time last year and now you've been with them for 12 months, you get a happy anniversary email. Their customers love it. The read rates are almost half as high again as their benchmark. You look at Expedia and their browse abandonment emails, and they see that you're looking for a trip to an international destination. You don't book immediately. And after a little while, they're encouraging you to come back. Hey, those flights are starting to fill up. Don't leave it too late. And again, extremely effective in terms of driving read rates and engagement that is significantly higher than their long-term benchmark. A lot of talk in the industry as well about responsive design. A lot of you will be doing this already, making sure that your email creative has been adapted so that it renders and views properly on mobile devices. I'm not going to sort of teach you all about responsive design. I'm going to talk about the benefits and some excellent research from Litmus fairly recently, which basically made the point that emails which have been optimized for mobile devices typically generate click rates which are about 20% higher than for content that hasn't been optimized. And what's particularly interesting is that, while you might think that you're doing that for users of tablets and smartphones, interestingly, there's even a benefit for users of traditional desktop devices, which suggests that even for them, the optimized creative is better to engage with than not. It applies to total click rates as well as unique click rates. And the estimate is that in 2016, we're going to hit an important threshold where we'll see over 50% of all brands sending emails using responsive design for their emails. We're also seeing the use of new technologies. You're going to be hearing a lot about contextual email marketing, so some of the smarter brands that we're seeing at the moment doing things like taking feeds from the local weather bureau, for example. And this basically operates in real time. So if you open the email from the sender today and it's a really nice day, they're going to be serving you with fashion ideas which have more of a summer theme to them. But if the nice weather goes away and you open it again next week and it's a lot colder, it'll automatically change and you'll be served with different content which is relevant to the weather conditions on that day. We're also starting to see the use of kinetic email. So here the idea is actually bringing more of the functionality that you'd typically find at the website after the click and putting it into the email itself. So with B&Q, you can see this kind of carousel approach where it's basically swiping sideways through a number of different pages in the email. The principle here is if you think that on average a good click-to-conversion rate is about 5%, that means that 19 out of every 20 clicks that you generate actually don't go on to purchase one of your products or services. The idea of bringing more of the website functionality into the email itself is that your customers are more primed to convert before they click through, meaning that 5% might become close to 10% or 15% and more revenue for you guys as a result. Those are sort of more technical ideas. What we're also seeing is a distinct shift to more clever use of emotion in emails as well, and sort of driving an emotional reaction from recipients. And the company that does this very well, and admittedly this is an English language example, is Waitrose. And they're very good at using language like richly warming reds for cozy nights in. And it builds a beautiful mental picture. You can almost taste that wine as it's being poured and feel the heat of the fire in the background. And it's extremely effective for Waitrose. Every time they use one of these very sort of vivid word pictures to describe the offer that's being made, the average response rate to those emails is about 10 to 15% higher than when they don't. And we're actually starting to see vendors in the marketplace, companies like Persado are probably one of the better known ones, that are actually starting to automate this idea of how to optimize your emails to create the most engaging, emotional experience for your customers. Final comment is a pretty obvious one. It's the old story that it's far cheaper to retain a customer than it is to win a new one. And we've done a lot of research ourselves in terms of the effectiveness of email win-back programs. We've established that where they're being doing well, the overall read rate is around 14%. It's a good number. And I think, you know, there's a lot of money to be made from effectively re-engaging your inactive audience, and it's easier to do that than try and win new customers. And I think there's many, many different approaches, but I think this example from Hilton Honors basically showcases a number of very effective approaches. There's a "we missed you" message, "we want you back," and by the way, if you do come back anytime in the next 30 days, we'll actually upgrade you as well. So 3 different boxes that they tick, and highly, highly effective in terms of driving engagement as a result. Last note to leave you on, sort of one that dropped into our inboxes literally just this week, a very effective one positioned as a wanted notice, with the reward basically being a €15 offer if you came back anytime soon. I've used up my full slot. I think we're definitely going to be around for the rest of the day, so if there's any more questions, you want to learn anything more about any of the content that I've covered, or get a copy of the presentation, do come and seek us out. We'll be here all day and in the evening. So thanks for your attention, and hope it was useful.